Hello and welcome everybody to this all-digital tortoise think-in on the all-important question of whether we as a species are actually serious about net zero when it affects the view outside the kitchen window. And if not, then what that means for, if we take the small scale UK policy and what it means for the planet. My name's Giles Whittell. I'm an editor at Tortoise, and I'm joined by three highly informed guest speakers who I think between them, as we were just saying, may have some diametrically opposed views, and I will introduce them in a moment. But first, there were two or three, perhaps four aspects of the context for this conversation that I wanted to pick out. They'll be pretty obvious, I think, to everyone. One is that earlier this month, the government produced its new energy strategy, which called for substantial increases in nuclear power and offshore wind power as part of a strategy for sticking to the statutory goal of net zero for the UK, but made no changes to current restrictive planning rules for onshore wind. That's part of it. High and rising energy bills. You cannot have looked at a newspaper in the past month and not be aware of that. And of course, the first increase in bills that came in on the 1st of April will be followed by another in October. The war in Ukraine, which of course has a direct effect on our, I was going to say a direct effect on our dependence on Russian energy. It doesn't yet, but it emphasizes our dependence on Russian energy. And lastly, the latest sixth report from the IPCC, which makes pretty clear an overwhelming scientific consensus that we're in last chance saloon if we are serious still about trying to restrict warming compared with pre-industrial levels to 1.5 degrees. And previous reports, as many of us will know, have highlighted the dramatic differences in projected effects of the difference between 1.5 and say 2 or larger amounts of average warming. So I hope that over the next hour, we can feel free to talk about the big picture, sort of central government policy, the effect of the war on this argument, but also I think we should talk about us as individuals. Our exam question, is NIMBYism killing the planet, really invites us to discuss climate in a very personal way, the extent to which we're hypocrites, the extent to which perhaps we haven't been paying enough attention to local community desires that may run counter to those of the planet as a whole, of the species as a whole. So very briefly, I am joined by three doctors, a trio of PhDs, Dr. Rebecca Windermere, who is a planner, an energy geographer, and a lecturer at the University of the West of England. And Rebecca has done some highly specialized and pertinent research on exactly which of the 89 local authorities in the UK have positioned themselves to allow more onshore wind and which haven't, and why. We're joined from California very glamorously by Dr. Stephen Jarvis, Assistant Professor of Environmental Economics at the LSE and author of a paper on NIMBYism, the economic costs of NIMBYism. I think it's the first time I've seen the word enter academic parlance. And by Dr. John Constable, Director of the Renewable Energy Foundation, which I think it's fair to say may have a broader definition of renewable energy than some people, but we'll find out more about that. Just as a reminder, this is a think-in. as I was saying to our speakers before we started, a big part of the point is to hear from everyone who's on what is in effect the call. If you've been to a Thinking before, you'll know the drill. Please talk amongst yourselves on the chat. You can raise a digital hand. I'm just reminding myself how. You can try also raising a physical hand, and we hope we'll see you. I only ever see about 4 or 5 people across the top of my screen. But please dive in. Don't wait till the end of the hour. Then we typically find lots of people trying to be heard in the last 10 minutes, and there isn't time for it. Luke is suggesting maybe NIMBYism will kill people rather than the planet. We shall see, Luke. I want to start with Stephen, since you've written the paper on the economic costs of NIMBYism and have been good enough to join us in the morning California time. Can you just start by putting us in the picture generally, possibly with reference to the government's new energy strategy? What did it do and not do for onshore, which I hope it's okay to focus on as a kind of onshore wind turbines, as a symbol of NIMBYism, and to what extent would you attribute that part of the strategy to NIMBYism?
Yeah, well, thanks very much for having me. It's great to join. So I think to answer your question, this has definitely been a hot topic of debate in the UK and in many countries around the world, the sort of role of something like wind power, particularly onshore wind. And this obviously came up again in the UK government's energy strategy. So my understanding of the main sort of announcements that have come out of it, I think there was some hope that a number of changes that were made around 2015 to make the planning rules more restrictive for onshore wind and to withdraw some subsidies that were available to them. I think there was some hope that some of those might end up being reversed, that maybe some of the opposition to these kinds of projects would have cooled. Doesn't seem like that's what's been announced. There's been some noises about trying to find more ways to make these more beneficial for local communities, but many of the same planning restrictions remain in place. And much of the energy strategy, as you mentioned at the top, is more focused on promoting things like nuclear power or offshore wind, which has tended to be less controversial, at least to date. So I think with respect to the energy strategy in the UK that you were talking about, that's been the key thing that I've noticed on the onshore wind.
Right. And I think I was going to hold this to later, but I think I'll dive in with the sort of the political caricature of this policy summed up by David Miliband of the Shadow Front Bench as a policy hijacked by Tory backbenchers. Do you think that is the case, or is it more complex? Is, as Luke suggests, Luke's very busy in the chat today, is NIMBYism sometimes justified?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, look, I'm less of an expert on the political dynamics within the Conservative Party, so I'm not going to spend too much time trying to figure out exactly what the calculus was, but definitely when these restrictions were introduced around 2015 under the sort of Cameron era, a lot of it seemed based on opposition from rural Conservative voters and maybe some backbenchers within the party, that these things were unsightly, or do we really need them? Is this a really good way of spending money? And it seems like maybe some of those sentiments have remained, and that's what's caused there not to be much of a change in the most recent strategy. But it's a little hard to piece together exactly what the rationale is. I'm sure others will have a decent view on that. I think to your second point about is NIMBYism ever justified, I think it's actually a really good question, and that's something that has come up in my own work. I think it's very easy to sort of be quite dismissive of the concerns that some local residents might have about a new project being built in their area. But sometimes those concerns can be based on real things. I mean, I might think that wind turbines look quite beautiful sometimes, and I'm quite convinced of some of their benefits. But other people might have different preferences, and some people might really not like having these things in their local area. There's definitely cases of people opposing these things. So I think it's important not to view these as being based on nothing. They can be quite genuinely held views. I think the key challenge is how much weight should we be assigning to those views? Clearly, there's a lot of different trade-offs we have to make in this instance. And so you want to try and weigh the potential objections that usually a relatively small number of local residents might have against all the other reasons we might want to build something like this, from tackling climate change, dealing with energy security, bringing bills down. There's clearly a lot of other arguments that need to be taken into account. And so I think that's the key thing to keep in mind when thinking about NIMBYism.
Now, your paper, the research for your paper produced an interesting, perhaps intuitive, but an interesting and fairly specific conclusion nonetheless about the distinction between wind and solar in terms of its reception by local communities. Can you say a bit about that?
Yeah, so I think at least historically in the UK, when you look at, so a lot of my research for this project in particular was based on a really fantastic database that the UK government has compiled and should be lauded for, where they essentially collect all the information of all the planning applications for renewable energy projects going back to the 90s. And it's a really great data set because it allows you to see all the projects that were built, but all the ones that failed as well. So you can sort of see how the planning process is actually functioning. And one thing that you do see from that is wind projects have a much tougher time in the planning process than solar projects do. It takes longer for them to get a decision, and most of the time the decision that they get is no. Less than half of wind projects actually end up getting planning permission, whereas for solar projects it's maybe closer to 80% are getting approved. And there's a couple of things that might determine that. Solar projects tend to be smaller, but also I think a key difference is they tend to provoke less of this opposition that you might see from local residents. I think in part, if you had some concerns about the visual impact they might have on the landscape, it's just not quite as significant as it is for a wind project. They're much lower to the ground. You can often obscure it behind a hedge. So I think they've tended to provoke less opposition in that sense. That might change over time as these projects get a lot bigger, and there has been some opposition. You mentioned I'm here in California now. There has been some opposition to some really big solar projects out in the desert. So they aren't immune to these problems, but at least historically in the UK, it's been wind projects that have had a much tougher time.
And just to pick up on what you're saying, as far as we can tell, it's for the very simple reason that wind turbines are highly visible. I mean, in your paper, you come down to distance from, and you can be less than a kilometre from a solar farm and have no local opposition. You can be 2 kilometres or more from wind turbines and local communities up in arms. And it's simply visibility. Or are we also talking about noise and dead birds?
Yeah, I mean, well, there's, again, as you mentioned, there's a number of different arguments that people can come up against as to why they might be in favor or opposed to these things. And I'm sure some of the other speakers can talk to that a little bit, and you can get a lot of that from actually surveying individual residents. At least my work that's tended to focus more on things like impacts on property values and decisions made in the planning process. At least when you look at measures like that, it seems like wind projects provoke more concern when you're really close to them and you can directly see them, and they therefore seem to also have a tougher time in the planning process.
Thank you very much. Rebecca, in your research, and I confess to only a partial reading of it, well, in fact, notes that you've very kindly submitted in advance, you point out that 89% of local authorities, if I understand it right, have assigned 89% have not assigned areas for potential development for wind farms, but the vast majority want to. Can you explain what's going on there?
Yes, so basically when the policy changed back in 2015, one of the main parts of that policy change meant that local planning authorities now have to allocate areas as suitable for wind energy, and they have to do that using a map. And that sounds like it wouldn't be too difficult, but in practice, it's very difficult because in order to put in that policy and kind of put in that policy map, they have to go through a lot of work of kind of updating their kind of overall planning policy documents. And if a local authority wasn't already planning to update their local plan document, then it's going to be really difficult for them to find the time or the financial resources to do this. They also need someone with the kind of expertise to be able to do that. So in effect, there's 11% of all local planning authorities have been able to do this. And I surveyed kind of every local planning authority in England. And the comments I was getting from those local planning authorities is that they want to do it. They want onshore wind in their area, but the current policy is just too difficult.
So it's practical process issues that are getting in the way, or is it also, as one reads, the fact that under current regulations you need unanimous consent, and so as critics of the policy put it, one person can prevent a planning application being approved?
So that's the second part of the policy that came in 2015. So you've got the first part, it's got to be located in an area as suitable for wind farms, and only 11% of local authorities have that.
Right.
And then in those 11% of local authorities, you then have to overcome the second hurdle, which is community support. And local planning authorities have found it really difficult to assess community support because of the wording of the government's policy, which basically makes it seem like you need that full community backing.
And is that correct interpretation of government policy?
The way it's worded at the moment, that's kind of how it's being interpreted, yes.
It's being interpreted by the planning officials who make the final decisions?
Yeah.
Right. It's very interesting. Rebecca, from if you take your specialist planning hat off for a second and look at the challenge broadly of reaching net zero, increasing the proportion of our energy mix that is zero emission, why not focus on offshore as the government is doing at the moment, given that you don't have any of these planning challenges, or very few of them, and the technology for floating turbines is now on the shelf and can be taken off the shelf, and the turbines can be vast?
So that's a good question, and I think really you need both. You need offshore and you need onshore. And the advantages of onshore at the moment is it's one of the cheapest forms of renewable energy to develop. It's quicker to develop. If you imagine kind of developing an offshore wind farm, that's going to take a long time. So it's just kind of a quick and easy method of increasing our renewable energy output. And in many cases, there's communities that want more wind energy, particularly where communities are able to directly own a wind turbine and kind of benefit from it directly that way.
Before I come to John on that subject, what is the current situation? What provision is currently made in the rules and regulations for benefits to accrue to the local community if they do agree to wind turbines in their backyard, as it were? As I understand it, the old feed-in tariffs are gone. Is that correct?
So in terms of community benefits, at the moment, a community is given a certain pot of money based on the output of the wind farm, and that money can be spent on kind of community projects. And that's given by the developer of the wind farm. That's not allowed, that kind of benefit isn't allowed to be taken into consideration in the decision-making process for whether a wind farm gets planning permission. But kind of another way that communities can benefit is through developing their own wind turbine. Mm-hmm. And I'm in Bristol at the moment, and there's been a community who's been able to do that, but that's extremely difficult. I think it's taken them 6 or 7 years to try and do that.
you say that that kind of benefit is not supposed to be taken into consideration when deciding whether to grant permission, but surely that kind of benefit could decide whether or not a plan gets unanimous consent from the local community.
So yeah, it may influence if people are opposing or supporting,
Right.
but for the planner that's making that decision, they're not allowed to say, yes, I'll grant this permission because it's bringing a certain amount of money to the area.
Understood. Okay, great. Gray Andrews, I see you've got your hand up, and I will come to you, but I want to come to John first. John, Rebecca just said of onshore wind, it is amongst the cheapest and it's relatively quick. Given the war in Ukraine, is there not now an overwhelming moral case for investing time and energy in the cheapest, quickest alternative to Russian gas? And I do appreciate that the UK specifically has a very small share of Russian gas in its energy mix, but we're nonetheless subject to world gas prices, which are affected by the war.
Well, it's a naive misconception to think that renewables will actually reduce dependency on Russian gas or indeed gas generally. The current problems have been caused by an undue concentration on renewables in the first place. So the entire UK system, the electricity network, now hangs by the single thread of gas because security of supply is guaranteed by gas turbines, renewables not contributing significantly to security of supply. So the fuel diversity problem which we have has been caused by the illusion of security given by the renewables policies. More renewables will actually make that gas dependency worse, not better. The only thing the government can do at the moment, and indeed it is trying to do it indirectly and under the covers of an aggressively renewable policy, is to rebuild the combined cycle gas turbine using higher thermal efficiencies, newer plant, and also to increase production from the North Sea, to stabilize gas consumption in the UK so that longer term contracts can be entered into, and ultimately, one suspects, to open up for shale gas exploration onshore in the UK. These will actually contribute to security of supply. More renewables simply won't. And the idea that they're cheap is, I'm afraid, a fundamental misconception. And this lies behind much of the local objection to renewables in the UK. Remember that local objectors are frequently retired people, experts, professionals, highly intelligent, well able to go into the economics of the renewables industry. And once you do that, you find out that it isn't cheap and that much of the claims of low cost are in fact illusory. So my colleagues and I have looked into the audited financial statements of wind companies and indeed solar companies, and the claims made by the industry for falling costs, capex and opex, are in fact false. Their capex remains stubbornly high, their opex is extremely high. These are very, very expensive ways of generating energy. Locals know this, they then see the local environmental impacts and they realize that they're being asked to make a futile gesture. So you're to harm the local environment to produce nothing. See, renewables don't actually have a long-term future. And those of us who really understand the physics behind this now can see that it will roll on for maybe 10 or 15 or 20 years. These are classic Veblen goods. They're a way of demonstrating that Veblen, Thorsten Veblen goods. These are ways of demonstrating that you are wealthy enough to afford a gesture. These are gestural political goods, and they're very expensive to maintain. So how long will the consumer go on being able to afford to pay for this? Cost of renewables at the moment is about 10 billion a year in subsidy, and there's no sign that our government is going to face up to chopping that away. So, but when these costs become intolerable, the renewables industry will simply fade away. The fundamental physics is hostile to renewable energy. This is low energy, high entropy fuel flow, and the service required by consumers at the other end, coming out of the plugs in your rooms and the businesses, that's a very low entropy electrical supply. So the cost of turning a sow's ear into a silk purse is intrinsically high, and renewables have no long-term future. In 30 years' time, 40 years' time, there won't be any renewables on any of the major economic networks in the world. They will simply be gone, and they will be
replaced. What will there be instead?
It'll be, I suspect it'll be nuclear in the longer term. The gas to nuclear strategy will have to be adopted by those economies that are actually sincerely committed to reducing emissions. It's the only way to do it. The gas problems that we have currently will have to be addressed by further exploration, the use of higher efficiency turbines. There is a risk, if the nuclear strategy is behind schedule, that we'll have to adopt coal. And I think that is actually now quite likely in Europe, where there are considerable problems, in which case we would be best advised to start planning for ultra supercritical coal, which at least would be as low emitting as we could make it to guarantee security of supply. It might not ultimately become necessary if the nuclear projects could be brought on stream. Remember, this is really about fundamental physics. It's about the entropy of the input fuels and the quality of energy supply required. And this goes back to the NIMBY point. You see, as I said, many people actually understand this. I mean, not the public discourse on energy in the press is extremely poor quality. The discourse at local level can be extremely high quality. Very well-informed people indeed who realize that the projects that are being proposed in their local areas really don't have much to offer at all. Now, the question of solar, for example, was raised, and it's relevant because it's becoming a very hot topic in the rural areas of Britain at the moment. Opposition to solar in the past was relatively muted because the projects were quite small. They're currently extremely large. I can think of one in Suffolk, which is between 2,000 and 3,000 acres.
I've lost you, John. Stephen, can you wave, and then I'll know whether it's me who's frozen. Oh dear.
Can you hear me?
I'm sorry. I think I couldn't tell whether it was me who'd frozen or you. I can hear you again now, John.
Okay. Let me tell you about this project. This solar project.
A lot of people want to come back on you on some of the things that you've said, and Luke is asking in the chat about your evidence for the claims about the physics. And yes, please say what you want to say about solar, and then I think I'll come to Bruce Davis, and then Stephen, if you want to come back. John.
Yeah, this solar projects in the past, yes, all right, the opposition was relatively muted because they were small. They're currently extremely large. There are many multi-thousand acre projects coming through. Locals look at this and they say, we're going to swap thousands of acres of British farmland for a relatively small capacity of solar. It's huge, but it produces, say, 500 megawatts at a load factor around about 10%. I mean, this is a trivial amount of electrical energy, and it's low quality electrical energy, and therefore the trade of food producing land for low quality food production, low quality energy production for electricity markets, it seems to be absurd to many locals. So they say this is stupid. We want local food production. We don't want bad quality electricity production here.
Okay,
so
John,
this is not irrational at all.
Forgive me for interrupting for a second. I want to quote to you something that Stephen has written, and then I want to come to Bruce and then back to Stephen. Stephen says, in the preface to the paper I referred to, what is clear is that what may seem optimal for a given local area can in aggregate create harmful outcomes for society as a whole. Would you accept that?
Sorry, you're asking me whether...
Well, in a nutshell, I think what Stephen is saying there in a polite way is, yes, NIMBYism is killing the planet. What I'm going to do is read that line out again, and then while you talk amongst yourselves, I'm going to choose a different router so that I'm not unstable for the rest of the hour. Given local area, a small community, can in aggregate create harmful outcomes for society as a whole. I wonder if you accept that principle.
It doesn't apply in this particular case, but people are objecting to things which are actually harmful to society. Renewables have damaged us economically. They've disrupted our energy supply networks very badly. We now have a close to dysfunctional electricity market and very high costs for consumers. Given that that has been caused by the renewable projects, NIMBYs have actually been benefiting society by holding things up.
Okay, Bruce, and Gray Andrews, I do see that you've got your hand up, but I wanted to come to Bruce first on this. What do you have to say?
So, yeah, I guess in the role that I've had, so what have we done? So I run a company that helps people invest and build these projects. Started 10 years ago with a wind turbine in the Forest of Dean, done 127 million of those since. Across a number of renewable technologies. I think the first thing I have to say is, well, that was an experience of sitting in these parish council meetings where people say things which frankly aren't true. And the physics of a wind turbine relate to the surface area of the blades. It's incredibly efficient. If we'd built wind turbines, we would not be experiencing the the extreme spike in energy prices that we're experiencing now. So I think that, you know, you only have to look at the Climate Change Committee's analysis. You only have to look at Lord Stern, the economist. People actually know what they're talking about to know that we've missed the benefits of developing renewables in the UK. It would have produced jobs. It would have produced economic recovery when we needed it coming out of the pandemic. And this is an example, the way that as I've experienced it firsthand, everywhere from the north of Scotland all the way down to the tip of Cornwall, at a local level, it is difficult to maintain this democratic dialogue because it is dominated by people who have, frankly, the time and the money to skew those processes and to disrupt them. And people like myself will stand up and defend them as best we can, because we're actually being paid to try and support that. But ultimately, the evidence that these things work is that they are now powering my pension and thousands of other people's pensions from generating that renewable energy. So I think, you know, what we get, and if you look at the average age of a parish council, is a conversation between people who violently agree with each other that they hate something and therefore can block it. And that's had, you know, significant economic consequences for all of us. And
but Bruce, in sorry to interrupt, in fairness to them, might they not in an important way represent the communities that they're a part of?
Well, what we find is that they don't represent their communities, because this point around unanimous support, you know, the support for renewables is at all-time highs. And even when you look at surveying that at a local level, where someone would actually be able to see that wind turbine, that is also rising. So no. And I think what we're seeing now, especially since councils, and we've got 65 to 75% of local councils declared a climate emergency, they've done that because they were listening to their citizens who said, you should be doing something about the climate emergency. And that's why local councils are now issuing local green bonds to develop their own solar renewables and everything else, but in part because their voters are demanding action. So we are dealing with a majority, and we are, last time I checked, a majority ruled democracy. And yes, a vocal and powerful minority are disrupting it. And at the moment, we don't have the mechanisms for that dialogue to be a fair one. What we get is a skewed dialogue. And part of that, I think, has been the mistake over the last 5 years in the media of giving equal balance to these arguments as if they both have the same level of scientific rigor about them, which they don't. But we treat it as if it is a debate in the Oxford Union rather than actually really questions of scientific fact.
Just one thing before I come to Stephen, and then as promised to Gray Andrews. You said rather gloomily, Bruce, that we've missed an opportunity to ensure that renewables, I'm not sure if I'm paraphrasing you fairly, protected us from fluctuating energy prices right now. But that doesn't mean, does it, that opportunity is gone, that it's too late to build the renewables dominated energy mix that many people argue for, in which you have an oversupply and any excess is used, for example, to electrolyze water for green hydrogen.
Well, we have the clock is running out. I mean, I think it is, but I think, you know, I've also looked at, interestingly, was invited to crowdfund nuclear power and was given a first-hand tour of a nuclear power station being built and how complex and difficult and environmentally damaging that is. And they still haven't finished it, and it's massively over budget. So I think there's, you know,
Which project are we talking about? Hinkley Point?
Yeah. Yeah, it's very impressive. It's bigger than the pyramids, but it's not finished yet. And to build out that level of nuclear power, if that is 10 years over, we want to build another 10 of those. We don't have a century to solve this problem. We have 10 years.
Right. Bruce, thank you. John, I did notice you rolling your eyes, and I promise you'll have a chance to come back on anything to do with green hydrogen or anything else. But Stephen, you have your hand raised, and then we'll come to Gray.
Oh, I was going to let Gray go first, but I'm happy to go in. I think I was mostly just going to. I think myself and John have a very different opinion about a lot of things, and that's not going to change by the end of this discussion. But I think just to push back on a couple of things that he was raising, I think doing a big dash for gas and trying to produce as much fossil fuels in the UK as possible now doesn't strike me as a particularly viable strategy. That it's not going to be a return to the sort of boom years of the 80s and 90s. The UK doesn't have the reserves to do it. And so we're always going to continue to be reliant on imports from abroad. And given that's the case, we're always going to continue to be exposed to these really volatile prices that people are suffering from now. So I think the real solution is to try and move away from a dependence on fossil fuels. And yes, that might well include nuclear as being part of the puzzle. I'm not necessarily opposed to that, but I think renewables is going to be another big part of it too. And the costs have come down a lot and are being rolled out at scale all around the world, not just in the UK. So I think there's a real strong argument for continuing to push that forward. And you would think that the urgency created by current events, the energy security crisis being created by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and I think growing concerns about tackling environmental issues like climate change, moving towards a future that's not dependent on these sort of fossil fuels strikes me as being essentially the critical way forward. We can get to some of the challenges and the barriers to that. I think NIMBYism is a big one, but I don't think renewed interest in things like fracking is necessarily immune to issues of NIMBYism either. You only need to look at some of the opposition that some of those early projects in Lancashire had to think that you're going to run into exactly the same sort of problems, probably even worse. So I think that there's a number of areas that I would push back on some of the things that John mentioned. But I want to make sure that Gray gets a chance to come in here as well.
Very public spirited of you. Gray, can we come to you?
Oh, yeah. I'm two speakers back. The guy criticised us retired folks. Well, I'm a retired engineer. And I've been in ecologies for, well, at least 25 years. I find a great deal of problems. NIMBYism is a very, very thin slice of a very, very big cake. I've been listening to your podcast recently about energy and sustainable energy. And the whole idea of shipping up electricity from the north of Morocco is a no-no. If we want energy security, we need to do it in the UK. We can do it. We need people that can actually sit down and plan and detail this. For all their well-meaning, politicians, parish councillors, etc., so that they have no technical knowledge. They are not so much worried with the how to, is like whether we want it or not. Well, there seems to be very, very little question of whether we accept the fact that we need some sort of renewable resources, because everything else is finite. And what Bruce just said about nuclear, yeah, it costs an enormous amount to build them. They take 10, 12 years to build. Then you've got all the decommissioning time, all the decommissioning costs. It's not even in the frame. The one thing we never, ever do, and it seems like almost a planetary thing, nobody says, save 30% off your energy bill by not using 30% of your energy. There are no campaigns towards this. During the 2 years that I spent in lockdown, yeah, I've saved about 32% on my energy bills just by wearing more clothes, cutting down on cooking times. It's a number one thing, that whole drive to go forward and find a way of producing more and more energy doesn't make people conserve it. Now, in another country, I've built my own wind turbine. I've never paid for electricity since I moved out there, and I'm now back here because of ill health. It's not difficult. It might be on a grid scale, but why do we need grid scale? Why don't we just go local, as been suggested? I'm presently living in Wales, and I think if you decorated the local hillside by us with wind turbines, you get very, very little pushback.
That's a key point. That really does come back to what we're discussing, Gray. And you said earlier that your impression is that there isn't a serious debate anymore about the need for more renewable energy, even at a local level. But what do you base that on? I mean, you say decorate the Welsh hillsides with turbines. My suspicion is that your community would be somewhat divided by that.
Well, where I live is coal mining industry, a dead end, really.
Right.
The jobs would be welcome, I think. It's just, I mean, when I object somewhat slightly, and although I'm not a house owner now, I've been a house owner in the past. Property prices. Well, I've always bought a house to live in. It's a home. It's not an investment vehicle. And again, some things are basically to do with where we live. Why aren't we passing legislation to have net zero houses? You can't develop any other sort. I'm not a great lover of the whole idea of these heat pumps in the land. I've seen them work, and I don't think they're that particularly efficient for the amount they cost. Take Musk's solar roof panels, local generation, where you can have it. I mean, locally, I don't think you get much pushback, to be quite honest.
Okay.
I live in a place called Blenheim, and I would think 2, maybe 3 wind turbines would power the whole place. I mean, it's local again. What you do about huge conurbations like London, Birmingham, Sheffield, God alone knows. But you know, it boils down to the same thing: use less, and you've got to generate less in the first place. But we never seem to encourage people or go towards the side where consume less less of everything.
Indeed, and the new energy strategy conspicuously omits new schemes to boost domestic insulation, which were going great guns until last decade. Yes. John, I promised you a chance to come back on some of these points, but it's Rebecca who's actually raised her electronic hand. So let me come to you, and thank you, Gray. Rebecca.
Yeah, just 2 points I wanted to raise in relation to what Gray was saying. I really agree with what he's saying on 2 elements. First of all, with the energy demand, it's clear that a key part of increasing our energy security needs to be reducing the amount of energy we're using through changes in people's behaviours, but also in things such as retrofitting our houses. So it's disappointing that was missing from the energy security strategy. And the other thing I wanted to raise was kind of in relation to communities being kind of quite supportive of new wind farm developments. So firstly, we're seeing from the government's own public surveys a high level of support for onshore wind. And also in my research, I went and spoke to communities that have been living with wind farms for 20 to 25 years. And I don't want to speak on behalf of those communities, but of the people that I both spoke to and kind of sent a survey to, a lot of people had a positive experience of living with wind farms because of both the community benefits they were getting, particularly in kind of lower income communities, and the kind of job creation and other benefits that they experienced.
Very interesting, thank you. John, for one reason or another, unit cost of wind and solar has come down steeply in recent years, solar in particular, partly because of economies of scale, because of large
It hasn't.
production.
No, it hasn't. You're quite mistaken about this. The cost of panels for solar have fallen, but the total installation cost for a solar installation has not come down. And the capex and opex for wind, for example, are actually still extremely high. Indeed, offshore wind, we know the big claims have been made for that. But in fact, capex has been stagnant since about 2012, 2013. Opex is still rising. And indeed, in solar, you see something very similar as well, that and although panels have come down, other parts of the total cost of building a solar farm have gone up very sharply. And of course, then you've got the grid integration costs, which mean that the kilowatt hours when delivered to consumers are extremely expensive. So those who know the industry very well are simply utterly astonished that there is so much positive rhetoric about the cost of renewables, because there is no evidence that any of these claims are substantially true. They are extremely expensive still. And that's astonishing, given that we've been subsidizing these industries for nearly 20 years.
What's the best source for your take on this? Because you know, even in West Virginia, it is now cheaper to increase solar power capacity than coal power capacity, and the industry there has been going great guns for the coal industry for 200 years.
This is what you've read. So go look at the audited financial statements for solar farms and wind farms in the United Kingdom if you want to find out what's actually happening. These are public documents. Anybody can go and do this. And of course, people in the city are already doing this. You know, city funds are already beginning to prepare short strategies on renewables because they can see that nothing has actually substantially improved in this sector. This is a bust. When it will go, as I said, we don't know exactly, because this is a classic Veblen good, very expensive gesture. When will people get sick of it and stop paying for it? Well, we don't know exactly, but the short is coming. And when it comes, it'll be very vicious.
Andrew Girdwood, you've commented in the chat on John's focus on CapEx and OpEx. Did you want to expand on that at all? I mean, do you have a view of how things are going to change?
I think it'll get cheaper. CapEx and OpEx and your operational costs, your capital expenditure. But of course, when you invent, and we are at the inventing stage, processes and technology to roll out wind farms, this is the most expensive it will ever be. Once that success is found and we can just replicate, it will get dramatically cheaper. I think it's a big red herring, this CapEx, OpEx obsession.
John, I wanted to put something else to you, and I confess this is sort of cherry picking from YouTube. I saw that you referred to the idea of decarbonizing the whole energy infrastructure as an insurance policy. A lot of people, as you'll be aware, regard it not as an insurance policy, but as a categorical imperative because of a climate emergency. What do you make of that?
Well, that's just poor thinking. I mean, this is a classic case where you have a harm and you have a cost of trying to mitigate it. So you have a social cost of carbon, which is the harm caused to human welfare by emitting a ton of carbon dioxide. And then you have the abatement cost of trying to reduce the emissions. Now, at present, social cost of carbon, most estimates, is around about $50 a ton CO2 equivalent. The abatement cost in the UK for rooftop solar, for example, is over $1,000 a ton. Offshore wind, $200 to $300 a ton. Onshore wind, $100, $150 a ton. So here you have a case where the cure is worse than the disease. We know this, and simply to say that the climate emergency is so severe that you have to do everything means that you have an unstated and unargued but very, very high cost, social cost of carbon, which none or hardly any, except the most extreme and implausible models of climate change, actually sustain. The central estimates of social cost of carbon are around about $50 a ton. None of the abatement costs in the UK come in under that. It's irrational to do what we're doing.
Okay, thanks. Stephen, yes, you've raised your hand.
Yeah, I mean, I think John is right when he's talking about that's one way that you can think about deciding whether or not an investment makes sense from mitigating climate change. I think there are a number of investments that we have already made that studies that the UK government has done, that Ofgem, the energy regulator, has done, have showed that the costs of them, some of the subsidies that have been provided to renewable energy projects, some insulation subsidies, have in fact reduced carbon emissions at a rate that's below the number that he's talking about. I think he's right on some other things, like rooftop solar have been a relatively expensive route to go down, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all these other sources of reducing emissions aren't worth pursuing and aren't cost effective to do so. And I think the key challenge is also more broadly, John seems to have a pretty firm view that the costs of these projects have not come down over time, particularly renewable energy. And I just have to flat out disagree there. And it's not just me that would disagree. I think pretty authoritative institutions around the world would also disagree. The International Energy Agency, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab here in the US, UK government, governments around the world in their sort of net zero projections. But not even that. private companies that have put a lot of money on the line and that are going out and building these projects and going out and building them now without any real subsidies are clearly putting a lot of their own money on the line that they can do these things at the cost that they say they can. So I think it's really hard to find some credible evidence that can say that the costs have not come down substantially for solar and wind over time.
Plenty of evidence.
Where is the best place to find it, John? I mean, you mentioned audited annual accounts. Has it been? Have you collected it at the foundation?
We have, and we've published 2 major studies looking at the audited financial statements, which you can obtain from Companies House if you wish. They're free to download. And we did it for 350 wind farms. And you can see very clear the econometric analysis shows the costs. There's no downward trend there, anything like what would be required to justify the claims made by the industry. We're shortly to publish a similar study on solar, which comes to similar sorts of conclusions. These are all public documents. You don't have to take my word for it. You can go and do the work for yourself. And it's not controversial amongst those who've actually spent time looking at the businesses of renewable energy companies on the larger scale. The smaller scale ones are different because you can't actually see their audited financial statements. So we don't know what's going on there in great detail, but because they're smaller, they're likely to be more expensive in actual fact. Okay, I stress, these are public documents. You don't have to take my word for it. Go and do your own research if you doubt it.
Stephen, you've raised your hand again. And by the way, let me invite, while there's still time, anybody, if we can bring the conversation back to sort of the NIMBYism argument where we started. If anybody else besides Gray has experience of living with large renewable energy installations, literally in their backyard or at the kitchen window, and whether they've found it a positive or a negative experience, please, now is your chance to pitch in. And I'm sorry if I've missed it already in the chat. Bruce, you've raised your hand, but I'm going to do it in order. Stephen, did you want to say something else?
No, just very briefly I know John was pointing to some work that his organization has done. I think I wouldn't point to some of my own work. I would more point to major organizations like the International Energy Agency, which is part of the OECD, and also the actual sort of statistics that come from these individual projects, which again, I'm happy to share some links to if people are interested in finding some of this information. But yeah, I'm happy to hand things over to Bruce. That was the main thing I just wanted to mention.
Bruce has had a bite at the cherry. We'll get another one, but Louise, you've raised your hand. Let me come to you, Louise. You look like you're in a blue squash court. Oh no. Louise, can we unmute?
I think I am now, and I apologize for the background noise.
That's fine.
I'm in the gym. You asked about anyone who's had a personal experience with living with renewable energy sources in their backyard. I used to live in Switzerland. I used to live really close to a nuclear power plant, such that they would send us anti-nuclear pills once a year in the event of
iodine
a meltdown.
Or something.
Yes, correct. But that being said, I never opposed nuclear myself, and it's been a matter of controversy in Switzerland. Currently, we have 4 nuclear power plants, and they have powered 30% of our energy needs, something like that. I need to double check. But a few years ago, the Swiss public voted to shut down all the nuclear power plants, and now they are all in the process of being decommissioned. I was personally against this move, but I wanted to ask John your opinion on particularly new age nuclear power plants, the likes of traveling wave, nuclear fusion, etc., and whether you think that they are a viable alternative to our current energy mix.
You're talking about the small modular reactors that Rolls-Royce and others are promising?
Correct.
John, please come back on that. And Bruce, we still have time. We'll come to you. John, small modular nuclear, another.
Yes, it's genuinely interesting. Largely because small modular reactors can address the need for heat. So a high temperature gas-cooled reactor, such as the Japanese have been running since 1998, can produce very high temperature heat for industrial process use, which is something renewable energy simply cannot touch. And that is genuinely interesting. These relatively small machines, they'd be 50 megawatts thermal. They're about the size of a medium-sized hotel. So relatively capable for application in industrial areas. They could also do electricity as well, but big nuclear reactors, pressurized water reactors, I'm less keen on. I don't think the Rolls-Royce proposal is particularly innovative, actually. It's a half-size PWR, it's not very exciting. I'd much rather see small-scale gas-cooled reactors, which have the option of producing both high-temperature heat and electricity if economic at that scale. And yeah, very interesting, worth support in the sense of encouragement. I wouldn't like to see them subsidized. We have a very bad and unsatisfactory record of subsidizing energy technologies in this country, and the renewables example is a ghastly warning. So yeah, lots of support in terms of encouragement and academic encouragement for new nuclear engineering courses, but no subsidies. Yeah, I'd be very positive about small modular reactors.
Okay, thanks. We can't let the ghastly warning terminology go unchallenged. Louise Simpson says in the chat, I'm very happy to have bought a house in France right next to a wind farm. My colleague Ellen Halliday says, I don't live near one, but my in-laws live next to loads of wind turbines. You can hardly hear them at all, even up very close. The first one was put up by a local resident himself. Bruce.
So in terms of living near one, yes, I live in the Cotswolds, and there's a consented 50 megawatt site just about to be built down the road from me. And there are several other consented sites in the local area as well, and they've had strong local support. And there also, the studies there have shown that in terms of the use of those fields, which are not prime agricultural land, but are low-grade agricultural land, they've increased the biodiversity there on those sites using the shade from the panels to increase the different types of insects and birds and so on that can live there. So, and that's also, studies have also shown that in the US. I think in terms of, I just wanted to find out who it is that's shorting the engineering process. So in every area of human technology, engineering has been able to reduce costs over time. And I just wondered why renewables are magically unable to achieve that. Unlike computers, unlike every other technology we've developed in the last 300 years, we've always been able to reduce the cost. So are engineers sort of strangely disabled when it comes to reducing the cost of renewables, or is it actually, I'll take that bet against whoever's shorting renewables getting more expensive, because that's a one-way bet. And I could find 1,000 investors that would also jump on that bet right now and make a lot of money going against your short. So,
okay.
That's you're essentially talking about a big chunk of the stock market is wrong. And the short sellers have somehow understood that the engineering process is going in reverse when it comes to renewable energy generation. And I don't know, but I think generally engineers reduce costs over time.
Thanks, Bruce. We only have a couple of minutes left. And what I wanted to do is come back to all three of our invited speakers. And then back to the question of NIMBYism, which I don't intend as a term of abuse. It's just a useful abbreviation. And I'm going to leave Rebecca the last word, since she is a specialist planner. But John, you can go first, and then Stephen, but it has to be brief. The question is, what change in law or rule change would you most value or think would be most effective in giving local communities a fairer shake at energy production in their backyard? John, you first.
Cancel all subsidies, cancel all targets for renewable energy, remove all the artificial incentives, and then see how many proposals come forward. The number will be greatly reduced. Local resistance will also evaporate.
Cancel all subsidies. Thank you very much. Stephen, and let's remember, the goal is to give local communities a fairer shake in energy production in their neighborhood.
Yeah, I mean, I think some changes to the planning process would be welcome, in line with some of the things that Rebecca was mentioning, some of the challenges that are there at the moment. But in terms of giving local communities a fairer shake, I think one of the other things that could be done is standardizing and giving local communities more of a clear sense of the benefits that they might see from having one of these projects in their area. there are some of these community funds that get created, but it's often voluntary and sometimes a bit vague exactly how local residents might benefit. So I think giving them more of a stake in these projects and a clearer sense of the way that they might share in the revenues that get created, I think that's a really big thing that could be worth focusing on.
Thank you very much. And Rebecca, as the professional planner, what do you think needs to be done so that local communities' voices are heard better?
I think there's two things. Firstly, for onshore wind, we need to remove the current planning policy that was brought in 2015, but in doing so, make sure that community consultation and community benefits are a key part of the policy going forward. The second thing is that we need greater support for community-owned energy. That was completely missing from the government's energy security strategy, and we need supportive policies and financial support for community groups that want to generate and own their own renewable energy projects.
Thank you so much. Really, you were all disarmingly obedient, brief, concise, specific, and really informative. Look, we've had what is unfortunately an unusual. I think thinking should more often be like this, where we have someone. We have diametrically opposed views slugging it out a bit. John, thank you for taking on that role. We let me speak for myself only. Respect the importance that you attach to rigorous research. We will at Tortoise accept your challenge. I will, for one, go back and look at the assertions that I've made and test them. I won't rabbit on now, except to say thank you, all three of you, and just to pick up on those final points, cancel all subsidies. I think that's something that we at Tortoise need to look very carefully at, because I'll be frank, I've never quite understood which energy sources are more subsidized than others, and clearly, given that demand is so high and will continue to increase, subsidy-free energy production is optimal. Stephen said, give communities a clearer sense of the benefits available to them from local energy projects. And Rebecca wants to go back to the status quo ante 2015. I'm well aware that perhaps there is this political question of why we got to where we got to in this month's energy strategy, which does come down to probably to a number of individuals in the Conservative backbenches and policymaking apparatus, and that is perhaps something we need to dig into further in another thinking. And we'll have Lara and Matt available to help us do that, I hope. But in the meantime, Stephen, John, and Rebecca, and everybody else who's joined us, thank you so much. It's been knockabout and informative, and I hope you'll join us for the next one too.